The notion of a train passing through Mount Washington began long before there was a single mile of railroad in Kentucky. The earliest notices were mostly to do with a train from Louisville to Bardstown, promoted especially by folks from Bardstown. As early as April 1832, the Bardstown Herald newspaper was calling for a public meeting to discuss that possibility, as you can see here. But time was not yet right for such a venture. Prosperity in Mount Washington was enhanced in 1837 by the construction of the Louisville and Bardstown Turnpike. A bridge was built across Salt River a few miles south of town. After that, the town became an important stagecoach stop. 18 years later, in March 1850, an act to charter the Bardstown and Louisville Railroad Company was approved by the Kentucky General Assembly. The commissioners established to do it included prominent men from Louisville, Jefferson County, Bullitt County, and Nelson County. It's interesting to note that of the 9 commissioners appointed from Bullitt County, 6 had ties to Shepherdsville and only 3 to Mount Washington, leaving the question of which route through Bullitt County was anticipated. However, their dreams were premature. Indeed, as Kincaid Herr wrote in his book about the railroad, the agitation for a railroad between the cities of Louisville, Kentucky, and Nashville, Tennessee reached its climax. Its final flowering occurred on March 5, 1850, when the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company was granted a charter by the Commonwealth of Kentucky for the purpose of building and operating a railroad from Louisville to the Tennessee line in the direction of Nashville. But first, they had to choose a route. According to Kincaid Herr, several surveys were done, and the railroad decided that either of 2 routes would be acceptable. One would pass through Elizabethtown and Bowling Green, the other through Bardstown and Glasgow. The decision would be made based on which communities along the way were most willing to raise funds to purchase stock options in the company. Although Bardstown had been an early advocate for a railroad, 2 of its leading citizens, Isaac Stone and Ben Hardin, were strongly opposed to the bond issue to raise the necessary funds, and it was narrowly defeated. Stone was a prominent farmer living near Bloomfield, and Hardin was a Bardstown lawyer and former Kentucky Secretary of State. Meanwhile, Governor John LaRue Helm, a native of Elizabethtown and an advocate for the railroad's construction, successfully promoted that city's participation, and the Elizabethtown route would be selected. Helm would later be the railroad company's president for a time. Likely foiled in their attempt to get the main line through Bardstown by way of Mount Washington, some in Nelson County began lobbying for a branch to be built. In August 1852, the Bardstown Herald printed a petition that recognized the likelihood that the main line was going through Shepherdsville and then Elizabethtown, and promoted the construction of such a branch that would lead to Bardstown and on to Springfield. They would get their branch, but Mount Washington would be left its mostly dirt roads, leading 4 ways from the crossroads to neighboring towns. With the main railroad passing through Shepherdsville and the branch line to Bardstown, Mount Washington was left with just the turnpike passing through on its way from Louisville to Bardstown. and the town's population declined. Then in March 1890, the General Assembly approved the formation of a corporation of 11 men under the name the Louisville Southeastern Railroad Company. This company was to construct and operate a railway line from Louisville through Jefferson and Bullitt counties, passing near the town of Mount Washington and on to Smithville near the Salt River. Each of these 11 men had an interest in seeing a track laid southward along Bardstown Road. For most, it was a financial interest because they owned land along the way. Before we discuss the outcome of this venture, let's identify the men involved. The three living the farthest north along the turnpike were George Scroggin, George Loan, and Judge William B. Hoke. Scroggin and his brother Hiram lived on land bordered by what is now Bardstown Road, Goldsmith Lane, and Hikes Lane, marked by the letter A on this 1907 map. George Loan's farm was located within the present bounds of Watterson Expressway, Newburgh Road, Bashford Manor Lane, and Bardstown Road, letter B on the map. And Judge Hoke's farm was located on the southwesterly side of Old Shepherdsville Road near the Louisville Southern Railroad track, C on the map. George W. Scroggin and his brother Hiram were in the horse trading business when George bought the old Bray place in 1888. He turned it into a horse farm that produced several Kentucky Derby contestants and one winner, Lookout, in 1893. George J. Loan was associated with his father, Dennis Loan, in the foundry business. In 1887, he purchased the Bashford Manor farm that lay west of the Scroggin farm. The proposed railroad might have passed between them or just to the south at the junction of the Louisville Southern tracks. As a youngster, Judge William B. Hoke attended the Mount Washington Academy. Later, joining the legal profession, he became a county judge for Jefferson County in 1866, a position he maintained at the time of the railroad charter. His farm was located near where the proposed railroad would likely begin, giving him a vested interest in it. A fourth member of this group was James B. Camp, Judge Hoke's son-in-law. Over the years, he worked in a variety of occupations, from journalist to secretary for the chief of police to business manager of an amphitheater auditorium, the job he held in 1890. It is likely that he was included both for his managerial skills and because of his relation to Judge Hoke. George W. Swearingen grew up in Bullitt County before moving to Louisville after the Civil War. He built the Millwood Distillery before becoming the president of the Kentucky Title Company. He joined other businessmen of the city to establish the Union National Bank about 1889. He never lost his love for his childhood home county, and this may have been the reason he joined this railroad venture. Moving south along the turnpike, we view a part of the map through which Floyd's Fork passed, and we come to the homes of the next three promoters. Dr. Thomas A. Hayes grew up in the family home at Fairmont, which then stood on the west side of what is today Old Bardstown Road, just north of Fairmont Road. It's D on the map. His family owned considerable land on both sides of Bardstown Road, giving them reason to join in this proposal. The Thixton family owned land adjoining Bardstown Road just south of Fairmont. According to an 1879 map, Thomas H. Thixton's home was along Thixton Lane, close by where Tunnel Way connects today. It's E on the map. As the elder member of the family, he joined this project in the family's interest. The three remaining men lived in Bullitt County. Francis Oliver Carithers was a director of People's Bank of Mount Washington in its 1890 incorporation. The Carithers family owned farmland on both sides of Floyd's Fork, with Francis's land lying on both sides of the county line, F on the map. He was also a longtime Bullitt County magistrate. The last two men involved in this endeavor were John T. Lux and James Douglas Wright, both of Bullitt County. We will delve a bit deeper into their lives. John T. Lux ended life in December 1911 as a resident of the Confederate home in Austin, Texas. A Texas newspaper printed a brief obituary that stated he was born in Kentucky in 1832 and served throughout the war in the Confederate Texas Brigade. He came to Texas in 1859. Where his life began and where he found himself along the way is part of our story. John's parents were John D. and Rachel Osborne Lux, who were residing in Bullitt County as early as 1830. They were the parents of 4 daughters before young John was born. Then, about 1841, they were surprised by the arrival of a second son they named Joseph. John D. Lux was a respectable person, a veteran of the War of 1812, but not a very successful man. His ventures having failed, he declared bankruptcy in 1842 and died 5 years later. We find Rachel and the family in the 1850 census in Mount Washington. They were perhaps living in a house that she would purchase from the estate of Rebecca Hall Newkirk in 1853. It was located next to the lot containing the Mount Washington Academy. Note that at age 18, John T. Lux was already teaching school, perhaps at the academy next door. This was not unusual, for students with some education were often hired to teach younger children. A decade later, it is Joseph who is teaching school, still living with his mother and 2 sisters. But where is John? He is still teaching school, but now in Taos County, territory of New Mexico. The Weekly Santa Fe Gazette in 1858 began running this advertisement regarding the school Lux had begun. It begins, Mr. J.T. Lux begs leave to notify the public in general of New Mexico that the 3rd term of the above-named institution will commence on Monday, the 14th of June, 1858. From it, we may conclude that the school had been in session for at least a year or more. John married Teresa Bent in September 1860 in Taos. She was the daughter of the late Charles Lewis Bent, governor of the New Mexico Territory, and niece by marriage of Christopher Kit Carson. Yes, that Kit Carson. Following her father's death in an Indian raid, she lived with the Carson family. A marriage begun with promise ended in March 1865 when Teresa sued for a divorce. Pictured here in later life, she would marry again and live a long life with her second husband. I've found no indication that John ever married again. We know from a few records that in early 1862, John was one of a group who left New Mexico traveling to Texas, where they enlisted in the Confederate Army. One newspaper article from 1901, shown here, written by a former student, tells us that following the war, Lux may have been making his way back to Kentucky when he was spotted in Kansas in 1867. Prior to that, it appears from this 1866 newspaper article that he was in Monterrey, Mexico, involved as an agent assisting Americans seeking new homes there. In May 1868, a Courier-Journal reporter wrote that Lux stopped at a Louisville hotel, and when we saw him, he was kindly feasting a curious crowd with an exhibition of a lot of Indian doings that he had purchased. Lux was said to have been the last 11 years engaged in the far west, trading with the Indians, and was on his way to visit his relatives. From the words and tone of this article, it appears that Lux had developed quite a way of spinning yarns. However, by 1870, John was back in Mount Washington, living with his mother and siblings, and clerking in a store. Brother Joseph continued as a teacher, but would soon move to Louisville, where he occupied himself as a quite successful florist. Recall that Rachel Lux bought the house and lot in 1853. This was located on the left side of a town lot number 74, as shown here. Then in 1871, Joseph purchased the rest of that lot and all of Lot 78 from W.W. Hall. By 1877, Joseph was in Louisville when he sold this ground to James T. Cunningham, who then sold it to Sarah Weeks, who then sold it to Rachel Lux in January 1879. By the 1880 census, only John, his sister Cynthia, and their mother Rachel were living in Mount Washington. It is interesting to note that John's occupation, if he had one, is not listed. As Rachel Lux approached the end of her life, she dictated a will in April 1888, leaving everything to John with the understanding that he would see to the needs of his siblings should they arise. The will was probated in November 1889 following her death. About this time, John entered into the agreement to be a part of the incorporation of this new railroad company. Perhaps to raise money to invest in this venture, he sold the 2 Mount Washington lots to Benjamin Brumley in December 1890 for $1,000. With the failure of the railroad to materialize, John T. Lux made his way back to Texas. He was 69 when he entered the Confederate home where he remained for most of the rest of his life. And finally, we come to James Douglas Wright, who owned considerable land south of Mount Washington, particularly in the bottomlands through which the Louisville-Bardstown Turnpike passed. His family had owned land in this part of Bullitt County dating back to his great-grandfather, Elijah Wright, who purchased his first Bullitt County property in 1800. By the time of his death, Elijah owned about 300 acres that he willed to his son James, who already owned an additional 100 acres that adjoined Elijah's land. In the next decade, James Wright, the grandfather, purchased 9 lots in Mount Washington and for a while operated what was known as the Kentucky Hotel, shown here in red. James and his first wife, Fanny, had 4 children, including their eldest they named Joseph Hedges Wright. After Fanny died, James moved to Louisville and married Elizabeth Dolp Shadburn in 1856. In 1857, James and his son Joseph purchased 350 acres from William Polk that lay mostly in the bottomlands north of Salt River, through which Whitaker Run passed, and which was adjacent to the turnpike to Bardstown. Its northeast part lays along Strainer Lane today, with its southern tip along Salt River. The drawing on the left is an approximate outline of this property, and the map on the right provides an idea of where it lay. After Joseph died, James sold his share of this land jointly to his son James C. Wright and Joseph's widow, Ellen. Joseph and Ellen were the parents of 9 children, including James Douglas Wright. In 1870, the family was living in Louisville. This census record tells us that Joseph was a liquor dealer, and we know he was involved in a distillery operation on the family land in Bullitt County. James Douglas's sister Lydia married Joseph O'Neill, a Louisville lawyer. In a brief biography of O'Neill in a book titled Lawyers and Lawmakers of Kentucky, we read that Lydia's father is a prominent merchant and distiller operating the Sugar Valley Distillery in Bullitt County. Following Joseph's death, the family leased the distillery lot to Samuel Carruthers. It was described as a strip of 1/2 acre of ground fronting on the west side of the turnpike 420 feet and running back 55 feet at one end and 50 feet at the other. After Ellen married William Burdett, she deeded her interest in this farm to her children. Then in 1885, in a court case to divide the value of the land amongst them, it was put up for sale, and James Douglas Wright bought it for himself. Thus, when the proposal to establish the rail line from Louisville was made, he was in a prime location to benefit from it, since the line would almost certainly pass through what was now his land. By May 1890, they had expanded their plans, and the General Assembly amended their charter, renaming their corporation as the Louisville, Monticello, and Tennessee Railroad Company. Their plan now was to extend the line from Smithville at the Bullitt County line toward Monticello in Wayne County and on to the Tennessee line. As this map shows, their earlier plans were now dwarfed by these much more ambitious plans from Louisville through Mount Washington and on to Monticello and beyond. They likely had their eyes on Bardstown, Lebanon, and maybe Campbellsville and Columbia as well. But first they had to get their financing in order, and that proved to be a problem. Railroad construction in the United States peaked in the early 1880s, when 8,000 miles a year on average was built. An even higher peak was reached in the late 1880s as the railroads provided important markets for lumber, coal, iron, steel, and agricultural products. Despite their combined wealth and stature in these communities, these 11 men needed the financial support of many others through the sale of stock to make this railroad a reality. A decade earlier, that might have been no problem, but by the beginning of the 1890s, a combination of economic factors slowed railroad investment. Then what is known as the Panic of 1893, followed by one in 1896, created an economic depression second only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Money for investments dried up, and the dream of a railroad to Mount Washington ended with it. It would be another quarter century before significant improvements were made to Bardstown Road down to Mount Washington, but the trains would never run this way. As you travel down the modern highway into Mount Washington today, cast your mind's eye back in time and imagine the trains that might have been.